Joining me on the program right now is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. How you doing, sir?
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you, and longtime fan. Thanks for having me on.
Long time no speak. Did you see the story about this imam in Beaumont?
I did. I looked at that and I said, he's brave and he's taken on the issue. He's being honest to our community, but he also missed threading the needle. And I can tell you what I mean by that. I just, this is the problem: is that both sides of the equation right now. One is the Hillary version, which looks at Islam as one version. It's all peaceful. There's no problem. Let's deal with this as a crime problem, which it obviously is not. It's an ideological. The other side, by overshooting and saying all Muslims are the problem, sort of misses our strongest weapon, which is Muslims that believe in reform, that believe in religious liberty. So, ultimately, the leaders need to be able to say, listen, we need to put a pause on all immigration. And the other thing he's missing is that it's not just Muslims. Obviously, it's Muslims that are ISIS, but in Syria, you've got Ba'athist, you've got Assad regime, Russian involvement. There's other threats to our security in the Middle East that are not only radical Islam.
Does it? And I think I know the answer to this. Does it break your heart to see your faith on trial like this because of the people who are committing acts of terror in the name of your faith?
Listen, actually, no. And let me tell you why. I wrote a book 3 years ago, The Battle for the Soul of Islam. After 9/11, we formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy in 2003. Our mission at the time was not to counter terrorism. Our mission was to separate mosque and state and to defend the U.S. Constitution and liberty against our foreign enemies. So we knew from the beginning that any honest Muslim knows that Al-Qaeda of 9/11 and now ISIS are simply a symptom of a much deeper global problem, which are huge political movements that won elections after the Arab awakening. And now, we see hundreds of millions in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iran, part of this time in history that Islam is in which we have to reject theocracy. And just as our founding fathers did, they loved their Christianity and they were from the lay intellectual community, but it wasn't the priests that fixed it. It was the lay community that separated and created a constitution that had an establishment clause. And, as painful as it is, as I said in our press conference of our reform movement last Friday at the National Press Club, we convened 15 different organizations. We said, listen, we want our kids and our legacy to be that our children will not have a conflict between being American and being Muslim. And right now, the ones that want to wear a jersey for some Islamic state, be it ISIS or Saudi or Iran or Egypt, some Islamic state are the threat. Those are anti-Americans, and we want our kids to not only want to wear the jersey, but to never want to wear any uniform except an American or a uniform of a country that's secular.
When we discuss these things, we're in a state of, dealing with people who have microaggressions and trigger warnings and things like that. And I try to remind the audience. They say, well, you sound like you hate all Muslims. And I will remind people, my daughter goes to a small pre-K, and my oldest daughter went to the very same pre-K, and we intend to send my now son. Since last time we spoke, my wife and I had our third child. It is run by a Turkish Muslim immigrant. If I had some legitimate fear, and I know that's not a bona fide, people say, well, you could like one person of a group, I wouldn't turn my children. I wouldn't turn my children over to somebody that I didn't fully trust. I think that's what I always say about people who like Ben Carson, that when you think that you could trust your child with someone, that's a very comforting thing. And it takes a lot to trust someone with your children, I think. And her and I discuss these things all the time, exactly what you're saying. Do you think, and I'll put it in the perspective of a documentary I watched on Jewish immigration, that there was a split. There were Jews that wanted to maintain every aspect of the old country's traditions, and then there were rabbis who said there has to be an American Judaism.
Exactly, and listen, I think for someone who's devout, and I just had a couple debates this week with Muslims that I sort of categorize as apologists and in denial. But the bottom line is that if you really love your faith as a Muslim, you're going to want to do everything possible to reform the ideas. Realize that there's a cancer. Just as in patients that get treated for cancer, they often will get sicker before they get better. So we as a community need to recognize that if we're going to treat this disease, our leadership is going to be, dig their heels in, because this is going to mean the end of the theocrats that are controlling our community, the end of the petro-Islam that's fueling million and billion-dollar institutions that radicalizes our community. And we have to redefine what radicalization is. Radicalization is not just the last few days when they start getting uniforms and vests and weapons. It's long before that. That's operationalization. Radicalization is when our community organizations are telling Muslims to be anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, to be anti-Western, to tell them that Americans hate them, and not to teach our kids about the fact that the best place to practice your faith is in a country that separates mosque and state, that allows you to be free to reject the imam or reject the government, Sharia, etc. And that's why our Declaration of Reform is so important to use as a litmus test to tell which Muslims are with us and which are really part of the problem.
Have you ever been called a sellout by anyone for serving in the United States Navy? I mean, that's a really, you see this a lot with people who have served in the military and law enforcement. There are always voices in their communities that if you join in with the government, or you join in with the military, or join in with the police, that you are actually rejecting your community by doing that. Has anyone ever accused you of that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's but there are many of us that served. And I wrote a piece back in 2008. I said, I wrote about why don't more American Muslims serve in the military, and I quote a statistic from the Air Force which said that there were more Wiccans serving in the U.S. military than there are Muslims.
Don't laugh. I know that to be true, because I was living at outside of Hurlburt Air Force Base, where they were debating whether or not Wiccans could do their solstice rituals, like in some of the wooded areas on the Air Force Base. I know what you're talking about.
And Muslims thought that was so hateful for me to say that. I said, listen, I understand the pathology. My family escaped abandoned Syrian nationalism in '63 as political refugees because the military there was evil, was fascistic, was slaughtering people, and they're still doing it today with chemical weapons and others. So the concept that many of our families brought to America was one that the militaries, be it in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they might be our allies, but most of the time these militaries are authoritarian dictatorships. So we have to teach our youth America's special sauce is not only our Constitution, but a military that is moral and that takes its orders from a civilian government, which is just an anathema to the understanding of governments in the Middle East. So this is the part where reforms are so important, and you can't. I really think that central to the battle against theocrats is not only a pushback against the violence, but a reclaiming of the moral nature of what it means to be moral. And, just like de Tocqueville in Democracy in America said, the reason America works is because it's led by God-fearing Christians that don't need military authority. So ultimately, the reason Iraq fell apart was there was no religion. It was just corrupt tribal mafiosos that were taking over. And ultimately, we need an Islam that is modern, that separates mosque and state, and believes in liberty to fix this problem. And Muslims that stay asleep are really significantly part of the problem.
How do you get this out? Because it seems like the American, like you said, Hillary Clinton, they have put this shiny, happy face on it. There's nothing that needs to be reformed. It's that Christians or conservatives or Jews need to give up their so-called Islamophobia. I think the hardest reform of any group that needs reform is from within, because there's always people that accuse the reformers of being part of the group that doesn't like them.
And that's why, our reform document, Declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement, and we have a Facebook page, Muslim Reform Movement, that is just taking off. From so many Muslims are saying, thank you for doing this. We didn't get into Quran, we didn't get into details. We just said, listen, here's 3 major areas with 9 major points. We're against all violent jihad. We're against all Islamic states, any Islamic state. We're against the caliphate. We're against Sharia institutionalized in government. We're not saying we're against personal Sharia of diet and marriage and last will and testament, etc., but we're against it in institutions. If Muslims can sign on to that, there's nothing that would allow Americans to fear any involvement of Muslims in society. If they can't, then basically they're an insurgency. because they might adhere to the laws of the land as a minority, but if they believe the law of the land should be the Quran as the Constitution and Sharia as the law, then ultimately that's an insurgency, and we Muslims have to be honest about that and not say that that's anti-Islam, because I'll tell you, Muslims like myself, the reason this can't happen, Andrew, in the Middle East, our allies in Saudi Arabia are in jail and getting flogged. In Egypt, they shut down 27,000 mosques. El-Sisi, the so-called reformer, he might be good against the Brotherhood and radical Islam, but he doesn't use words like liberty and freedom. And our allies, believing Muslims, are actually being persecuted right now, as they were under the Brotherhood. So this whole paradigm has to change, and America needs to get into the mix, or else continued two sides of the fascist coin will continue to dominate foreign policy and domestic policy.